Hey everyone, welcome to a Talking Feds duo with the estimable Matt Seligman, who's been with us before. He's a fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford, a lawyer and legal scholar, and really just a much more than a buff, a real expert on all the kind of small and large features of the election, including what's going on in the field. I just wanted to talk to him so he could help us kind of situate what we might be expecting over the next period, the last few days before the election, the formal election day, going to, say, January 6th, because he's thought about it quite a bit, and I've talked to him about it before. Matt, thanks again for joining.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we've had a relatively quiet, is that fair to say, or at least uneventful in terms of changing things, period of lawsuits and such in this lead into November 5th itself. Yeah, is that, how would you characterize the days we're living through, and do you see anything big on the horizon between now and Tuesday?
So it's interesting, the perception that there is of the litigation landscape now and over the last month or two, because you're right that there hasn't been, for example, a blockbuster case that's reached the Supreme Court that has really rocked the election landscape. On the other hand, there are many more lawsuits that have been filed over the last 60 days than there have been in any preceding presidential election cycle or any election cycle. So we're talking about, at this point, well over 100, in total, I think over 250 lawsuits that have been filed since January 1st of 2023, and most of them in the last several months. So there really has been a huge onslaught of litigation, but it hasn't really gone anywhere yet. And so the big question that we're going to look at in the next couple of days, and then really in the days after Election Day, the days and weeks after Election Day, is whether some of these lawsuits sort of become something that they haven't been so far, or if new lawsuits that are filed that sort of echo some of the issues that have been raised already, and then become that blockbuster that we haven't yet seen.
And in the razor-thin election that we're in, especially in swing states, just something, this is the lesson of 2000, right? Some little thing that we can't anticipate in some county might be enough to serve up delay, or against the backdrop of what could be, not necessarily, but what could be a very close contest. You don't know what could rise up in significance based on what's going on in the states. Just to stick with what's happened to date, I mean, I do think the headline is sort of the dog that didn't bark, and many courts, especially I'm thinking of Georgia, have pushed back on efforts brought by Republicans, who more frequently been the plaintiffs, to try to do things that the general thrust, which would have been to narrow the franchise. There's one case, though, and I wonder what you think about it. So it's not all that big in numbers, but in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin initiated this program of cross-checking registration data with DMV data daily and using it to invalidate some registrations, though you can still revive them. But, 6-3, and the sort of scary lineup that one worries about going into the election period. What do you think about the Virginia case?
Well, I think it's important just to level set about what this case is really about, because there's a lot of mischaracterization, particularly among the right-wing media. Elon Musk has said some things about this case that just aren't true. So the issue here is a systematic program to remove people from the voter rolls in Virginia. And this is something that states do on a continual basis. And in some respects, it's a totally normal and proper thing for states to do. Now, there's also a
people
federal
die, or
people die, people move,
right? Yeah,
and so that voter roll maintenance is an important part of election administration. Now, there's also a federal law that imposes a quiet period for 90 days before an election. And the reason why, and so what this quiet period does, is it says that states can't do this systematic voter roll maintenance during the couple of months before an election. And the reason why, and to counter some false narratives out there, it does not prevent states from removing non-citizens from the voter rolls. What it does is it prevents these systematic programs right before an election, because there are a lot of false positives. And as we've seen in this Virginia case, there are American citizens who have been purged from the voter rolls because they have a name that's the same as somebody who is a non-citizen, or there's some other bad data there. And so the reason to have this quiet period is because right before an election, if an eligible voter is improperly removed from the list, they're not going to have enough time to be able to fix it, or they might not. Now, as you mentioned,
or it's just a pain and it's just an extra obstacle. It's like, are you going to go get a driver's license in the next week, in a busy world?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so now it turns out that the number of people affected in Virginia is relatively small. And Virginia, thankfully, has same day voter registration. So when someone goes to the polls, they can register on that day. Although, as you note, that can be a hassle. People might not have the documentation they need and so on. So I'm not trying to minimize the problem, but it's not the kind of numbers that you sometimes hear about where, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people might be removed from the voter rolls. Now, so why should we care about this anyway? And the reason we should care about it is the fact that the Supreme Court did what it did and what that might mean for other cases. Because the Supreme Court put on hold a lower court ruling saying, no, you can't do this. That violates federal law. And the Supreme Court 6-3 on a party line vote, an ideological line vote, put that lower court holding on hold, allowing the voter purge to go forward, even though it seems to pretty clearly violate federal law. And compounding that problem is the Supreme Court didn't explain why it did it. This was done on an emergency basis with an emergency petition to the Supreme Court by the state of Virginia to get rid of this lower court ruling. The Supreme Court, the 6-3 majority, granted that and didn't say why. And so we see here a situation where there's something that pretty clearly violates federal law. There was a lower court ruling saying, hey, you can't do that. And the Supreme Court
two lower court
rulings, and the Supreme Court intervened, didn't say why. And so that's concerning because both for process reasons and for substantive reasons. For process reasons, there's no reason why he couldn't have told us in a paragraph about, okay, we think that this is the reason why. And so provide some guidance to other courts. And so the fact that it looks like it's doing something ideological and partisan right before Election Day and not explaining why really, I think, undermines the legitimacy of the court's actions in these election law cases. And as I think we probably agree, the Supreme Court's legitimacy and credibility is in short supply already. And so it's compounding the problem when it does things like this. That's the process point. And then substantively, it does concern me that when there does seem to be a clear violation of federal law here, even if it's not going to swing the outcome of the election for Virginia, at least not the statewide presidential election, it may for local races. But the fact that the Supreme Court seems to be doing something that is pretty detached from the law and not explaining why makes me worried about what it might do in the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the old, we're not final because we're infallible because we're final. To the extent there were arguments, joined, and the Biden administration was in on this case, the argument from Virginia seemed to be, well, this isn't systematic, which, as you point out, that's what the law prevents your doing in those 90 days. And why not? Well, because it's one voter at a time every day. Under the governor's program, the DMV must furnish records from the DMV and they can be compared with voter registration. But it really does seem to make a mockery of the notion of systematic. Every voter purges individual, one at a time. This seems certainly a wholesale kind of notion, but if something like this, if what the six were thinking is not systematic, good enough for us, then yeah, the augury of what we could be looking at is really unnerving. Okay, hey, let's pick up the rest of this conversation over on our Patreon and talk about what's happening after the election. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.